We all used to think that we know our loved ones. We build relationships, trust each other, go through life's difficulties, and eventually confidently assert, I know this person, we have been together for so many years. But what if one day what seemed absolutely obvious collapses like a house of cards? What if everything you thought was true actually turns out to be a lie? How do you react when your perfect life, your perfect marriage, that you were so proud of, suddenly turns out to be nothing but a disguised illusion? How do you survive that moment when all your certainties turn to dust and the only thing left is the bitterness of disappointment? He had always thought that his marriage to his wife was something exceptional. They had been together for over a decade, and in his eyes their relationship was the standard of harmony. He was proud of his family, of his children, of his wife, who seemed perfect in everything. Thinking back to their moments together, he thought they had built the perfect world. They were partners, friends, lovers all in one. He loved her and she loved him. There were no major conflicts, no unresolved issues. He was sure their relationship was unbeatable. At first everything was as it should be in a happy marriage. Every evening they sat at dinner, discussing the day, laughing, joking and sharing plans for the future. She always supported him in difficult moments, and he was her rock. Everything looked like they had everything perfect, like the people in the magazines. Yes, they had their routine moments, but they, like many other couples, thought it was an inevitability of everyday life. But they continued to believe in their fairy tale, a perfect relationship that was, they thought, protected from all storms. As the years passed, his confidence only grew. He got used to her presence, her smile, her affectionate words, but here was the strange thing, she seemed more and more withdrawn. But he didn't give it a second thought. He was busy with his work, his family, and always assured himself that everything would be fine in their lives. Maybe she was just tired, maybe she'd had a rough day, something easily explained. He, on the other hand, was in love, and to him, love always meant stability and certainty. And despite the small changes in her behavior, he hadn't noticed anything that would make him question his feelings. And then one day, everything changes. It starts with a small, inconspicuous detail. An ordinary situation that could have gone unnoticed. A man comes home earlier than usual. Usually she was home, doing chores, meeting him for dinner, but that day was different. He walks into the apartment and notices she's gone. The kitchen is empty. The hallway is silent. He calls her, but she doesn't pick up. It's not like her, always so caring and attentive. He starts to worry, thinking something has happened to her. But after a few minutes, she calls back. Her voice is calm, but something in it sounds different than usual. She says she stopped by a friend's house, then quickly ends the conversation. It was strange, because she hadn't hidden little things like that before. The next morning, he finds a letter in her bag. The letter wasn't for him, and it wasn't from someone he was familiar with. The name he saw there couldn't have been just a coincidence. He feels everything tighten up inside, like something is getting heavy. He tries to convince himself that this is just a misunderstanding, but he can't. After all, up until a few months ago, they had discussed how important sincerity was in a relationship. And now he finds himself in this surreal position where the only thought that keeps him going is that something in her life is hidden from him. Why is she hiding these things? Why is this starting to come out now? He can't figure it out. It's not just a secret, it's a whole world he didn't know. He can feel the anxiety growing in his chest. But he can't believe she's hiding something from him. He wants to think that everything will explain itself, that it's just a coincidence, that this person doesn't matter, that it's just a mistake after all. But lo and behold, she doesn't explain. She doesn't explain why her phone was left on the table with an open message from this unknown man. She doesn't explain why her looks have become so aloof and her conversations with him so short. In that moment, he realizes that the perfect picture they've been living in has begun to crack. A small crack, but big enough to make him wonder. Now his thoughts revolve around this one thought: what if everything he knew was an illusion? What if everything he thought was true was actually a lie? With each new suspicion, with each new discovery, his feelings become more and more tense. He doesn't know how to be. He doesn't know how to live with this knowledge if he really is to uncover all her secrets. He can't understand how this could have happened, and most importantly, how he didn't notice it before. Everything he thought he had is now in question. He stands on the brink. Is he ready to face the fact that his world may come crashing down? And what if the truth turns out to be far more painful than he can imagine? It all started with nothing changing in their lives. It was an ordinary evening like many others. The husband came home after work, put his bag on the floor and took off his shoes. He knew his wife should be home by now. She always came a little earlier to make dinner and wait for him when he got home from work. Usually it was some light conversation about how the day had gone, and then they would sit around the table and have conversations that ended in laughter and jokes. The evenings were just like the early years of their marriage. No particular excitement, no shadow of suspicion. But that day something was wrong. He opened the door and immediately felt the silence. There was a strange emptiness in the air. She didn't meet him at the door as usual, didn't smile at him, didn't ask him how his day was. It was so unlike her usual behavior that it immediately caught his attention. "Honey?" he called out, standing on the doorstep. "Are you home?" From somewhere in the depths of the apartment came her reply. She was in the kitchen, but her voice sounded unusual, too calm, almost detached. Something in its intonation made him wary. "Yeah, I'm here. Coming in a minute." He shrugged, thinking that maybe she was just tired. That was okay, everyone could be a little aloof sometimes. He didn't get upset, went down the hallway and changed his clothes. After a minute she did come out of the kitchen, but her gaze was somehow blank tired, as if she was not quite here but somewhere far away. "You don't look right," he remarked, trying to relax and let her know he cared. "Is everything okay?" She nodded, but her smile wasn't as genuine as it usually was. It was like a pretense, like she was forcing herself to smile. He didn't even know what alerted him more, her look or the fact that she disappeared so quickly into the other room. "I'm just a little tired," she said, almost without looking at him. "I think I need some rest. Have you eaten?" "No, I just got here," he answered, feeling a slight uneasiness rise in his chest. Something was wrong. It was strange, even for her. She never hid in another room so quickly, she always spent time with him, even if she was tired. She usually said rest after spending time with him. He noticed how quickly she left for the bedroom, and that moment was a turning point for him. He stood in the kitchen, pondering her strange behavior. He couldn't understand why her aloofness was so keenly felt. He tried to brush it off, but the thoughts wouldn't leave him. She had always been so open, always sincere. But that night something had changed. And he didn't know what to do about it. He went after her. He opened the bedroom door, but she wasn't there. She was in the bathroom, and the door was slightly ajar. When he looked in there, she wasn't visible, just her silhouette moving in the shadows. Before he could even speak, she had already quickly jumped out of the bathroom and blocked the door with her. I need some time to be alone for a while," she said, almost without looking him in the eye. That answer was too short, too strange to be true. The man felt a chill begin to build in his chest. He knew her well enough to know that her behavior wasn't just fatigue. And while he didn't want to take it as something serious right away, there was a growing feeling inside that there was some mystery here, hidden from him. He drove to work, but he couldn't get rid of the thought of what had happened last night. Something was wrong, but he didn't know what it was. The next day he came home early again. He thought that maybe he just hadn't had time to notice all the little things. He hoped that maybe his worries were just the result of fatigue or his tendency to worry too much. But when he opened the door again, he was met with the same strange silence. And this time she did not come out to him at once. She was still sitting in the kitchen, but she sat down in a way that made it seem as if she were waiting for something he didn't know about. She was with him again, but at the same time as if she were far away. He went up to her and asked with a sense of uneasiness, "Are you out of sorts again? Has something happened?" She looked up for a moment, but quickly averted her eyes. Her face was calm, but he couldn't help but notice how her eyes didn't meet his, as if she couldn't or wouldn't look him in the face. "It's okay, I think I need some time to myself," she said, forcing herself to smile again. "It's no big deal." But it didn't sound like it normally did anymore. He felt his nerves tighten even more. His thoughts began to race in circles. Something wasn't right. Something in her behavior alarmed him. Over the next few days, her behavior became increasingly strange. Sometimes she avoided looking him in the eye. Sometimes she was alone with herself, sitting in another room, hiding her gaze when he came in. Every now and then she would start telling stories about her work, but they always seemed superficial and devoid of emotion. And he, as always, tried to convince himself that everything was fine. He was just too worried. But every day this anxiety grew stronger, and his attempts to hide his doubts became futile. He began to notice more and more little things that wouldn't have caught his attention before. She started checking her phone much more often, but always hid the screen when he approached. She became more private when it came to her weekend plans, and tried to avoid talking about where she'd been and with whom. Then one day he noticed her hand twitch as he casually glanced at her screen, seeing a name in her contacts that he didn't know. He tried to hide his gaze, but he couldn't. His heart began to beat faster. "Who is it?" he asked, not taking his gaze off her phone. She froze, her face becoming tense, and she quickly hid the screen. "It's just an old acquaintance." "You don't know him, don't worry," she replied, her voice sounding a little strained, like she was trying to convince not only him, but herself as well. He didn't know what to think. He was confused. All this time he had been trying to avoid the idea that something was wrong, but now his suspicions were keeping him on edge. He didn't know what was going on, but he felt that something was hiding from him. And this uncertainty, this feeling that the truth was somewhere near, but he couldn't get at it, had become agonizing to him. Every day when he got home, he tried not to think about what was troubling him. He kept convincing himself that it was all just his fantasy, that she was just tired, that everyone has moments when they get a little detached. But it wasn't helping. He kept noticing oddities in her behavior, and each new observation became more and more alarming. His life was starting to feel like an unfinished detective story, and the worst part about it was that he didn't even know where to start looking for answers. All the little misunderstandings, the strange looks, the attempts to avoid answers, it was as if his own wife was playing some kind of game and he didn't know the rules. And this sense of growing tension consumed him more and more. He couldn't go on living without knowing the truth. He felt that somewhere out there, outside their home, lurked something that would change everything. But how to access that truth? How do you open the door that hides all the answers? He didn't wait, he took action. He knew she always left her phone on the table when she went into the other room. He didn't want to be the one to violate her personal space, but at this moment his mind was just screaming that he needed to find out the truth, and better now than later. He crept over to the table where she had left her phone and, at first thinking it was just a one-time thing, picked it up. He tried to be careful, but his hands were tense, his heart beating faster and faster. When he opened the screen, the very same list of missed messages appeared before his eyes. Messages she'd never mentioned. Messages from people he didn't know. Strange names, even some unfamiliar numbers. He started going through them, and each new conversation began to make him question what he thought of his wife. One of the contacts caught his attention. It was a name he had never heard before. He wanted to call to find out who it was, but immediately froze, as if someone invisible had stopped his hand. He put the phone aside and sat down in a chair. His whole body tensed up like a string. He wanted to believe it was just a misunderstanding, that she was just chatting with people he wasn't familiar with. But these missed messages, this strange correspondence, and most importantly, their frequency, spoke of something much more. She returned to the room a few minutes later, and he felt his heart refuse to calm down. She smiled as she always did, but now her smile seemed somehow fake to him. Like she was trying to hide something important. He couldn't shake the feeling that her behavior was becoming more and more opaque. "Are you looking for something?" Her voice sounded wary, and he noticed her glance quickly at the phone he'd just been holding. He felt his throat tighten. She'd always been open with him, always shared anything that bothered her. But now she was clearly trying to hide something. Every move she made, every look in her eyes became suspicious. He didn't know what to do with this knowledge. It felt like if he kept looking, it would all come to light, but what would happen next? And more importantly, who would he be when he opened that door? "No, I just thought you were okay," he said, clenching his teeth, trying to hide his growing anxiety. "Is everything okay?" She nodded, but it wasn't a sincere nod. It was just a gesture, like she was trying to reassure him and herself that everything was still the same. "Everything's fine, just work," she replied, but her eyes didn't meet his. She was again trying to back away from the conversation, as if she didn't want to reveal anything more than that. He felt his doubts begin to grow, his mind overflowing with questions. He wished he could just believe her, he wished he could think it was all coincidence. But the more he tried to think about it, the clearer one thing became: something was hidden, something she wasn't ready to tell him. Over the next few days, his concern became more and more apparent. He thought more and more about her strange messages, the fact that her phone was now not just left with missed calls, but was now hiding new contacts. He began to notice that her gaze was becoming more and more detached. Everything she said now seemed less sincere than before. Every move she made caused him to doubt her. Then one day he went to her phone again when she wasn't home. This time he knew he had to see everything or his mind wouldn't rest. He opened the message list again. He noticed a new name in his contacts, a name that immediately caught his attention. He read the last few messages, and realized it wasn't just anyone, but someone who was very close to her. Everything he thought he knew was now crumbling before his eyes. This was too much for him. He didn't know what to do. He knew that if she didn't tell the truth, he wouldn't be able to live with it. But what if that truth proved too painful? What if she was involved in something far more serious than he could imagine? His inner conflict grew more and more intense. He wanted to believe her, but he couldn't. He didn't know how to tell her that he knew what her phone was hiding, or what his reaction would be when she finally told him her secrets. But now, more than ever, he felt he couldn't stay in the dark. He couldn't afford not to find out what she was hiding. With each step, each new discovery, his world became less and less stable. He didn't know what his wife was hiding, but this feeling that the truth could be discovered after all was becoming more and more obsessive. The more he tried to avoid the truth, the closer it came to him. But how would he cope with this knowledge if, in the end, it proved more devastating than he had imagined? There was no rest for the man. Every day, every move he made around the house was now associated with a constant feeling of anxiety, which grew stronger each time. He tried to talk himself into thinking that he shouldn't get worked up, that he shouldn't suspect his wife, but he couldn't. Something was wrong. These oddities, these looks, her aloofness, she was withdrawing more and more into herself, and every time he tried to figure out what was going on, he was confronted with new mysteries that kept him unsettled. He began to notice how often she looked at her phone. More and more often her hand was clutching the screen when he entered the room. Sometimes he caught her quickly hiding the screen when she noticed him approaching. At some point he decided he had to do something about it. He couldn't continue to live in this invisible fear. He needed to know the truth, even if that truth could destroy everything they were building. One day, when she left her phone on the table again, he felt this moment had come. He picked up her phone, clutching it in his hands as if it was the key to unlocking all his questions. But this time, he already knew what to look for. He opened the call history and his heart almost stopped. Missed calls, unusual contacts, names that were not familiar to him. It was all like a maze he didn't want to get into. He tried to look through their correspondence, but soon realized that she had deleted almost all the messages, leaving only a few. There were a few phrases that were unsettling, making his heart beat faster. "You promised me everything would be fine. Who was this person? Why were these messages going unnoticed? And most importantly, why was she leaving them hidden?" He kept looking. He opened the photos, and in one of them he saw a person he didn't know. It was a picture from some vacation, from a cozy cafe, where his wife was sitting with this man. She was smiling, but her eyes were not the same as usual. There was a man in the picture that she was clearly more than just acquainted with. He could feel a sense of betrayal growing inside him. But this was only the beginning. Over the next few days, he continued his investigations. He happened to find a note in her bag, carefully folded and hidden. It was handwritten and contained only one name. It was that of the man in the photograph. At first he was sure it was a coincidence. Maybe it was just an old acquaintance she hadn't mentioned? But the more he tried to find an explanation, the more doubts appeared. He felt his heart hammer harder as he started going through her contact list. He found this number. It was encrypted, as always. She'd called it by some sort of alias. But it wasn't just a name, it was more than that, as if she was purposely trying to hide it. Why was she hiding him? Why hide communication with this man? The man stood on the brink, and each new step only deepened his doubts. His life became like a movie in which he was the main character, but he didn't know what turn of events awaited him. He felt like the more he learned, the more he was losing control. He saw how her behavior continued to change, how she kept hiding her actions more and more. When she was around, he tried to find answers to all the questions that haunted him, but all he heard was a generic "it's okay" and "I love you." Those words didn't comfort him, on the contrary, they became more and more fake. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something far more from him than just an affair with this man. Everything in her demeanor, everything in her eyes screamed to him that there was something else important that he hadn't been shown. Everything was connected to this man. He tried to imagine who he was, what he was to her, but he couldn't imagine an answer that would reassure him in any way. The more he tried to find answers, the more he lost. He knew her secrets weren't just about cheating, she was hiding something much deeper, something that called into question everything they'd built together. Every time he saw the look in her eyes, every time she avoided his questions, he felt his world crumble. He didn't know what he would discover, but he couldn't stop. He knew he had to figure out what was behind that name, behind those secrets. He had to find out what she was hiding, even if it meant he would ruin everything. But things weren't coming together. He began to realize that the answers he was looking for weren't just keeping him down, they were putting him in front of even more questions. Why was it all so hidden? Why did she keep hiding the truth from him? Why was she so good at creating the illusion of a perfect relationship, but actually keeping him in the dark? He could feel his thoughts becoming more and more confused as he was lost in conjecture, not knowing exactly what was going on. He became even more attentive, watching her every move, her every word. He tried to find the key that would open this door. But every time he thought he was close to a clue, she went off in another direction, hiding from his gaze. Every movement she made raised new questions for him, every word she uttered now seemed full of innuendo. He did not know what all this would lead to, but he felt that he was on the verge of discovery. With each step he was getting closer to the truth, but each new step raised more questions for him. Why was she being so secretive? Why isn't she telling him everything? And most importantly, what would he find when he finally got to the truth? He could no longer think this was all a coincidence. It was all too elaborate, too carefully hidden. He had to find out who this man was, why she was hiding him, and what was really going on in their relationship. But no matter how hard he tried, the answers still eluded him. He stood in front of her bedroom door, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. All this time he'd been trying to convince himself to stay out of her personal affairs, that he could get past this moment and forget about it. But now he knew he couldn't. He was on the verge of discovery, something he could no longer avoid. Everything he had experienced over the past few weeks was pushing him toward this decision. He had to find out the truth, no matter what it was. He took a deep breath and knocked. For a moment there was silence in the room, as if everything inside had frozen. When she finally said, "Come in," her voice was steady, even a little tired. It wasn't like her usual way of speaking. He walked in. Her gaze immediately became intense, but she didn't get up. She sat on the edge of the bed as if waiting for him. There was no fear or surprise in her eyes, only something new, something he couldn't make out. "We need to talk," he said, his voice not as firm as he wanted it to be. He could feel the tension building inside him. He wasn't prepared for what was about to happen, but he knew he couldn't hide his questions any longer. She nodded and sat silently again, crossing her hands in her lap. There was no sign of excitement in her face. It was as if she already knew this was going to happen. She didn't try to make excuses, didn't try to hide. Just sat there and waited. "You know what I found," he said, trying not to look her in the eye, even though she was sitting only a few feet away. His words were full of pressure. It wasn't just a confession, it was a statement. He knew she would know what he meant. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, her lips trembled slightly and she sighed softly. "You found the pictures. You found the notes. You found what I was hiding." Her voice was cold, but there was no anger in it, no fear. She wasn't trying to make excuses. "You're right, I cheated on you." His gaze lingered on her face. He expected to hear it. He knew it was the inevitable answer, that this was what he needed to hear. But his soul couldn't accept those words. He felt something in his chest tighten, as if the world he knew was crumbling before his eyes. He had expected this, but he wasn't ready. But she continued. "But that's not all," she said, finally lifting her gaze and meeting his eyes. "I didn't cheat on you because I didn't love you. I cheated on you because I could no longer be the person you saw me as." He couldn't understand her words. He couldn't understand what she meant. Everything he knew about his life, about his love, about his family, it was suddenly not what he had imagined it to be. His heart was beating faster and his mind was all jumbled up. He didn't know what to say. "Are you saying you didn't love me?" he asked, barely containing his rage and bitterness. "You betrayed me, you ruined everything, and now you say you didn't love me?" She did not object, only shrugged her shoulders slightly. "I loved you," she said softly, but her words brought no comfort. "But sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes people start living lives that aren't what they dreamed of. We became strangers to each other. And I had become a stranger to myself." He stood listening to her, and with each phrase she spoke, the world around him became more and more chaotic. He didn't know what to think. He didn't know how to feel. She continued, and with each word she spoke, his world crumbled even more. Didn't you notice how I shut myself off from you more and more? How we started living like two people who were just sharing space but not living together. I was there for you, but I wasn't with you. I started looking for something that would give me back my sense of life. And I found it. I met him. He felt the blood freeze in his veins. This man she hadn't mentioned, who she'd kept from him. He clenched his fists. You speak of him as salvation? You think it was a way to get your life back? His voice shook with pain, with rage. He couldn't understand her. He couldn't understand how she could do this to him. She looked at him again, but now there was something deeper in her eyes than mere apology. It was a realization that everything they'd been building no longer made sense. He didn't save me, she said, her voice a little quieter now, almost lifeless. He just gave me a chance to be myself. He made me feel like I wasn't lost. I didn't seek him out to betray you. I sought him out because I'd lost myself. We stopped being a team, we stopped being partners. We just became two people who lived under the same roof but were actually far apart. He stood there, feeling his inner world crumbling. She spoke as if it was his fault. As if he hadn't noticed how they had lost each other. But he couldn't believe she hadn't seen what was happening. He couldn't believe that she didn't try to find solutions and just walked away into someone else's arms. Were you happy with him? He asked, his voice barely audible, full of disappointment and pain. Or was it just a way to escape? She closed her eyes, and something like regret flashed across her face. I can't answer that question, she said. Maybe I was just trying to find a way not to be what I'd become. Maybe I hoped it would bring me peace. But I was wrong. He stood there, listening to her words, and felt his own world shattering. Everything he had known, everything he had thought about his life had turned out to be wrong. He tried to collect his thoughts, but all he heard were echoes of her words. She was no longer the woman he had started to build his life with. He didn't know what to do with that knowledge. You betrayed me, he whispered, barely holding back tears. You ruined everything. We can't go back to the way things were. You changed us. She didn't object. She just sat silently with her head down. And then, in that moment when he thought all was lost, he realized that what he thought of his marriage was just an illusion. He didn't know his wife. He didn't know who she really was. And worst of all, he didn't know what to do with that knowledge. She wasn't the woman he saw her as. And maybe they had never been as happy as he thought. He sat on the edge of the bed, unable to get up. Her words still echoed in his head like a thunderclap and wouldn't let him go. He couldn't understand. He couldn't make sense of what she had told him. Everything he knew about his life now seemed like a lie. There was so much understatement in her words, so many unseen gaps, that each new confession became just a piece of a puzzle he couldn't put together. He could feel his inner struggle growing more and more desperate. Every question he asked, every answer he received seemed incomplete. She tried to explain, but the more she spoke, the less he understood. The man sat in the dark. She had gone into another room, leaving him alone with his thoughts, with his anxiety. He felt his mind screaming, demanding an answer, but there was no answer. Every time he tried to make sense of what was happening, every time he tried to figure out what was wrong with their relationship, he was faced with a new, deeper and deeper frustration. Her words kept him on edge. Her confessions, yes, she had cheated on him, yes, she was looking for something else in her life, but what did it all mean? He tried to pull himself together, to try to make sense of her explanation, but it was like trying to put together the disparate pieces of a mosaic when the pieces themselves were missing. How could this have happened? How could everything they'd experienced together be nothing more than a deception? He tried to remember the moments when everything had been normal, when they had laughed, when they had made plans for the future, when they had been close to each other. He couldn't understand how their relationship could have been so different. How could it be that he didn't know his wife? How could he have been blind to what was happening right in front of his eyes? He stood up, not knowing what to do next. Her words kept flashing through his mind, and they didn't add up to a clear picture. I couldn't be who you saw me as, her voice echoed in his ears. Those words wouldn't go away. He tried to find the logic, tried to understand what she meant, but all his attempts were futile. He wanted to believe that all of this was the result of some mistake, some temporary weakness on her part, but deep down he felt that wasn't the case. She wasn't who he thought she was. And worst of all, He didn't know who she was now. He remembered their first meetings, their first days, when everything had seemed so simple, so right. He remembered her eyes, full of trust, her hands that held his, her smile that warmed him. He remembered the way she looked when they first started dating, the way she laughed and the way she talked about the future. It had all felt so natural, so genuine. He couldn't understand how what was the foundation of his life could have changed. With every word she said, his sense that everything in his life had turned upside down became more and more vivid. But now that she had confessed, now that he knew the truth, he couldn't find answers to his questions. He couldn't understand how they'd gotten to this point. He couldn't understand how she could keep these things from him. And most importantly, he couldn't understand what he should do about it now. He tried to talk to her, to ask her why things had gotten this way, but every time he opened his mouth, she was silent. She couldn't give him clear answers. She couldn't explain what was wrong with them, why she was hiding her feelings and desires from him. He sat in silence and felt his thoughts becoming more and more confused. He tried again to find an answer, but it was as if his thoughts were going into the void. She had cheated on him, but for a reason. It wasn't just a casual infatuation or cheating for the sake of cheating. It was something more, something that couldn't be explained. And he couldn't figure out what it was. He couldn't find logic in her behavior, in her words. He couldn't find an answer to the question that had haunted him from the beginning. Why had she done this? He got out of bed and walked to the window. It was dark outside, and in that dark background he could feel his life becoming just as hazy and uncertain. He didn't know what to do with this knowledge, this feeling of emptiness that filled his soul. He didn't know what to do with this new realization that his wife was not the person he knew and loved. He didn't know what would happen to them now, to their family, to their future. He began to remember again moments from the past when they had been happy. But now they seemed distant, like alien memories. He wanted to believe that it could all be fixed somehow, that they could put things back the way they were, that their relationship could be brought back to what it used to be. But inside he knew it was impossible. He knew that everything he'd built, everything they'd built together, had crumbled. And now, when he tried to find the answer to the why question, he was only faced with emptiness. He decided to talk to her again. He wanted her to explain to him, to tell him why things happened the way they did. But every time he started talking to her, every time he tried to find out more, his questions went unanswered. She couldn't tell him why things happened the way they did, she couldn't explain how she felt or why she acted the way she did. Her whole explanation had to do with her inner emptiness, with the fact that she couldn't be with him anymore, that she couldn't be the woman he expected her to be. He tried to understand, tried to find something that could make sense to him. But there were only more questions in her words. He didn't know what he should do. He didn't know how to move forward. He felt like he was at a dead end, and no answers she gave could lead him out of that dead end. All he knew was that they had lost each other, that their relationship was no longer the same. But why? He couldn't understand. Why their lives had suddenly turned into this chaos, why her confessions gave him no peace but only intensified his inner struggle. Why couldn't he find peace now, even when he knew the truth? And it was at this moment, when he couldn't find an answer, when his thoughts were filled with nothing but questions, that he realized his life would no longer be the same. Everything he knew about his future now seemed impossible. He didn't know how to move forward, but he knew one thing: nothing would ever be the same. Weeks passed, and he continued to live with her, though each day was like agony. Their house, once full of warmth and light, now seemed empty, even when they were near each other. He woke up next to her, but he couldn't escape the feeling that he didn't know her anymore, that all his ideas about marriage, about love, about their relationship had been shattered. And even when they talked, when she tried to get back to normal, he couldn't find the sincerity that used to bind them together. He continued because he couldn't find the strength to leave, but inside his soul was split. He tried to get something back, some memories of what they used to have, to try to believe again that they could be happy. But it was like looking for light in a fog. He felt like she was near, but so far away at the same time. Even her presence didn't give him the confidence that had once come naturally to him. Now he felt only heaviness, the heaviness of something that could not be returned. They were talking, trying to talk, but something had changed. He noticed how her words sounded different now than they had before. He'd asked her about the future, about what they could do to go back to being the people they were before everything fell apart. But her answers were always tentative, unsure, as if she already knew she couldn't get back what was. And that hurt him. Her words didn't give him reassurance, but only added to his doubts. He couldn't find that simple answer that would give him clarity. He couldn't believe in the future they were building. He didn't know what would happen to them next, and every day was like a step into the unknown. "You know I can't be the woman you want me to be," her words kept echoing in his head. And he realized that it wasn't just a simple confession, it was deeper than that. It was an admission that everything they had experienced, everything they had built, was just an illusion. He didn't know what to do with that knowledge. He knew he couldn't just forget what had happened, but he couldn't walk away from her either. His love, his affection for her had not disappeared despite all her secrets, all her mistakes. He knew their relationship had changed forever. He couldn't take things back to the way they used to be. He could no longer believe in the simple ideals that had once held them together. He could no longer see her as the woman he had built his life with. And all these unanswered questions continued to plague his soul. He tried to understand what was going on, he tried to make sense of what was happening to them, but all his attempts only ended in a new circle of doubt and pain. One day when he was back in her room, sitting next to her, his gaze stopped on her face. She was sitting across from him, trying to look calm, but he could see her eyes averted, the way she avoided looking in his direction. She kept saying something mundane, but he wasn't listening anymore. He could feel this moment, when they both realized that all was lost, just hanging in the air between them. The whole truth, the whole gravity of what had happened was in front of him, but it remained hidden. He knew he would never have all the answers. He didn't know if she had ever been sincere with him, or if it was just a game, or if he had been blind to her inner world. But now it was too late. "You don't want to talk," he said, quietly and without emotion, as if it wasn't something important. "You don't want me to understand. And I can't keep looking for answers. I'm tired of these questions, tired of this uncertainty." She was silent, but he saw her eyes cloud over. Perhaps it was regret. Perhaps it was just fatigue from all the lies that surrounded them. But something had changed in her gaze. He didn't know what it was, but there it was. And he realized that her silence was also part of their story, her answer. She wouldn't give him all the answers, and he couldn't make her do it. He stood at the door, and strangely enough, he didn't feel relieved. He didn't know what was going to happen to them next. They were both so tired from fighting their own demons that they couldn't move on. He realized that he couldn't continue to live in this vacuum, this state where every day was just a continuation of yesterday. He didn't know what would happen to their relationship. He didn't know what would happen to his life. He only knew one thing: they wouldn't be the same anymore. "I can't leave her," he thought. "I can't leave her, despite everything." He couldn't figure out why. Maybe it was just habit, maybe it was some other thread that bound them together after all. But he knew it was impossible to stay in this relationship, where every word, every look was full of pain and unspoken words. And all he could do was go on living, trying to find some meaning in this emptiness. He walked over to her, quietly, almost inaudibly, and put his arms around her. She didn't move, her body was still, as if she couldn't feel anymore. He felt her breathing become slow, her body relax in his arms. He tried to find the words, but they were stuck in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what they would do, what would happen next, but in this moment he didn't care. He felt her in his arms, and that was all that was left. All they could both realize was that nothing would ever be the same again. So they sat there, silent. And he realized that this would not be the end of their story. Maybe they would stay together. Maybe they would split up. But one thing was certain: they could never be the same again. The story has no ending. They can't be happy, but they can't walk away from each other either. The answer to the question of what will happen to them will remain unclear. It will remain an open question, just like their relationship. And this is how their story ends, with a sense of incompleteness, with both of them living in the shadow of those questions that will never be answered.